superiority of a, sorry, I got the message that we were being recorded. Got it? Okay. So the concept is deeply embedded in national narratives that affirm the spatial history and in some instances the inherent and God-given superiority of a people and their institutions. The claim to exceptionalism is common to all nations. To this extent, exceptionalism is utterly unexceptional. All societies formulate their own allegories and create their own legends to demarcate themselves from others. This active fabrication, however, betrays the banality of exceptionalism. And yet, the claim of exceptionalism requires that the invented historical narrative be perceived as truly real. If all nations are exceptional, however, not all of them are exceptional to the same degree or are viewed by others as exceptional at all. I analyze in the book Haitian and American exceptionalisms as mystifying narratives that invent their national histories by both purging them of their injurious stains and embellishing them with mythical innocence. My goal is to expose exceptionalism's omission for what they are, a nationalist mask hiding depravities and crimes. By glorifying a country's uniqueness, exceptionalism transforms the entire polity into a sacred city on the hill and its citizens into agents of a superior civilization. It is, in its more extreme version, the city is not merely on a hill, but is in fact sacred, chosen by God for an exclusive people to carry its mission on earth. In the American case, exceptionalism is an unforgiving narrative legitimizing expansion and conquest in the name of a divine mandate. In his inaugural address in 2009, Barack Obama, the first African-American president and the son of a Kenyan, delivered a stirring rendition of American exceptionalism. And I quote, "We remain the most prosperous, powerful nation on earth, and we are ready to lead once more. We will not apologize for our way of life, nor will we waver in its defense. And with eyes fixed on the horizon and God's grace upon us, we will carry forth that great gift of freedom and deliver it safely for future generations." Obama's invocation of God in defense of America's freedom and way of life is not new. It is fundamental in the American form of exceptionalism. In fact, this invocation precedes the very foundation of the Republic. It is as old as the first European settlers who set foot on its shores. It has always legitimized the project of those in power, whether it be their massive and brutal appropriation of the so-called unoccupied lands of the indigenous populations, their defense of slavery and white supremacy, or their exclusion of those who had yet to be among the chosen or were altogether otherized. Belief in the nation's exceptionalism is thus closely bound to founding national myth. While it cements unique bonds of fellowship among citizens, exceptionalism excludes those who are deemed unfit to belong to the God-chosen community. The reasons for exclusion vary. They can be tied to ethnicity, race, class, religion, or gender, and they can change over time. As I tried to argue in the book, exceptionalism is not a frozen and fixed narrative. As a social invention, it can be continuously modified, and while greater inclusion can be written in new versions, the core exclusionary principles remain in new forms. This reinventing is in turn dependent on the hegemonic capacity of the ruling class, on whether it has the infrastructural power to gradually co-opt and include into the national project those that it had previously excluded without altering the fundamentals of the system. Not surprisingly, the material wealth and cultural dominance of the American ruling class has facilitated the co-optation of those who had remained politically and economically marginalized or otherized from the community of the chosen. The inclusionary reach of American exceptionalism developed very slowly over a long period of time. However, the foundational principles of American revolutionary constitutional claims of freedom, democracy, and equality coexisted at first with the annihilation of indigenous people, the preservation of slavery, and later, a limited franchise and segregation. That most Americans rarely evoke the chasm between reality and national narrative is an indication of the continuing hold that exceptionalism has on their collective imagination. Similarly, Haitian exceptionalism has rooted itself in revolutionary claims of individual equality and racial justice, but in fact, it has always been ridden by extreme patterns of class and color exclusions. All nation states have their myth of origin and celebrate their presumed uniqueness, but not all exceptionalism are the same. Haiti's extolling of itself as the only nation to have a successful slave revolution and as the world's first Black independent country, not only has had a significant influence on its own citizens, but it has also inspired colonized and subjugated peoples, especially those of African descent. Yet, like its American counterpart, Haitian exceptionalism is a fabricated narrative. It glosses over the despotic tendencies of the Haitian founders who ruled with an iron fist and lorded it over the vast majority of the emancipated population. The ideals of democracy, equality, and liberty, unleashed in the struggle against slavery and foreign control, had little to do with the daily routine of Haitians. Class, gender, geographical location, and indeed color remain powerful markers of inequality and marginalization. The revolution ushered in liberation from enslavement, a radical rupture with Western racism, and the first, albeit constrained, Black national sovereignty, but it also left a persisting legacy of inequalities, authoritarianism, and messianic rule. Exceptionalism is always a very truncated and embellished national narrative that ultimately serves the interest of ruling classes. Certain versions of it can legitimate imperialism, especially when in the hands of great powers. In such cases, expansionist forces justify their annexations, conquests, and wars against so-called backward and rogue societies in terms of their alleged civilizational and moral superiority. The imperial vocation of American exceptionalism has always been legitimated in these terms. For instance, America's understanding of its mission, whether it be expressed in President Trump's condescending description of African and Caribbean nations as, and I quote, shitholes, or Hillary Clinton's unilateral declaration that America is an exceptional nation that is also indispensable because the rest of the world looks to the United States for leadership, or again, President Trump taking a page from Hillary Clinton's repertoire on threatening Iran with obliteration because it may desire the same kind of weapons that the United States has in its own arsenal. Clearly, such self-important assertions are only taken seriously when uttered by leaders of hegemonic powers. The admonishment is hyperbolic, but yet it is taken very seriously. If it were a different type of leader. Let's imagine, for instance, that it would be a Haitian president, and that Haitian president were to try to menace the United States with military intervention or economic sanctions because of its treatment of African Americans. That would be a farce. It would not be taken seriously. And yet, such threats are the embodiment of US foreign policy. They are the ordinary, acceptable, and rational ramifications of American exceptionalism. The effectiveness of exceptionalism thus correlates with a nation's infrastructural power. As the dominant military and economic world power, the United States has justified its global and imperial reach in the name of its own exceptionalism, a feat that is clearly not in the cards for a peripheral country like Haiti, whose ruling class is utterly dependent on foreign financial and security forces for its very survival. Sitting in the periphery of the world economy, Haiti's exceptionalism has little resonance beyond its border and sounds increasingly hollow in Haiti itself. However, by nourishing the collective imaginary with the story of a world's historical emancipation that crystallized against all odds, Haitian exceptionalism still generates some hope that change is indeed possible. After all, if enslaved people could revolt and overthrow a white supremacist colonial order, there is no reason to believe that Haitians could not now again take matters into their own hands and extricate their country from its disastrous predicament. The possibility of fundamental change that the memory of 1804 opens up is nonetheless unlikely to suffice. Because Haitian exceptionalism has, among other things, hidden the original roots of discord, the internecine divisions of color, the exclusionary patterns of governance, and the system of class rule that characterized the island nation as its inception, Haiti's mythic view of itself cannot offer a programmatic solution to the country's modern quandary. Like its American counterpart, Haitian exceptionalism must be demystified. It is only by doing so that both countries can begin to envisage a different and more emancipatory future. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. So I am actually going to jump in and read a response, and then we'll open it up to the conversation. I do have some questions woven in, quite a bit in fact, so hopefully that will launch discussion, but these are by no means, the questions. I would love, again, for this to be truly a conversation. And I'm gonna start a timer because in the spirit of this being really, opening it up, I don't want to talk for too long. All right, so in his 1990 article, The Odd and the Ordinary, Haiti, the Caribbean, and the World, Michel Trouillot took aim at what he called the fiction of Haitian exceptionalism. For Trouillot, one of the main problems with this fiction, besides it being often derogatory, sometimes racist, and usually condescending, was that it promoted the assumption that Haiti was so unique that it escaped analysis, that it was beyond compare. He writes, when we're being told, quote, when we are being told over and over again that Haiti is unique, bizarre, unnatural, odd, queer, freakish, or grotesque, we are being told in varying degrees that it is unnatural, erratic, and therefore unexplainable. We are being told that Haiti is so special that modes of investigation applicable to other societies are not relevant here, end quote. One answer, or at least a start, according to Trouillot, is a methodological shift. I quote again, quite simply, we need to drop the fiction, inherited from 19th century racist literature, that Haiti is unique. If by unique, one means that it escapes analysis and comparison. Haiti is not weird. It is the fiction of Haitian exceptionalism that is weird, end quote. I wanted to start with these arguably now quite familiar words from Michel Trouillot, at least in Haitian and Caribbean studies and among the audience here, not only because Robert Fatton cites them in the book, but because they are at the heart of the book's methodological approach. Haiti requires comparison. I would also be remiss if I didn't point out that these words from Trouillot on Haitian exceptionalism also frame Marlene Dout's foundational 2015 work, Tropics of Haiti, in its effort to combat the Haitian exceptionalism and fictions that Trouillot identifies. And Marlene herself does this through a comparative transatlantic and hemispheric framework. And of course, you, Robert, cite Tropics in your book. And so starting with this comparative frame is the way that I want to kind of center my response today, thinking about what this comparative frame illuminates about the interconnected history of Haiti and the US and what it might say about their futures, what other exceptionalisms it illuminates, and here I'm thinking about French Universalism specifically, and finally, what may get lost or minimized in this comparative frame. And actually, in terms of a roadmap, I'll start with this last point and work my way backwards through those points that I've listed here. To do this, to at least start about this question of what a comparative frame might actually efface or limit in our view, I wanted to situate myself in my work because I too work on Haitian national myths in my book, Haiti's Paper War, which Marlene already alluded to in her generous introduction. My book focuses on the complexities and nuances that shaped Haiti's post-independence civil wars, complexities and divisions that I argue are effaced by the myths of the Republic. I find this especially true in the slippage between 1804 and 1806, engendered by what I call the myth of the inevitable Republic. And just to reiterate for clarity here, the Haitian Republic declared itself in 1806, not 1804. And even then it was mired in contested rule and civil war for nearly 15 years after that. A durable, united Republican state did not emerge until 1820 when Jean-Pierre Boyer unified the Southwest and the North into the Republic. My exploration of the discursive making of the Haitian Republic and its myths, the stories that get told and the beliefs that result from them, thus shares quite a bit with your unmasking of national narratives and myths, Hubert. On the other hand, though I do frame things in a wider French Atlantic backdrop, my work is decidedly not comparative in the Troillotian sense. Not because I'm refusing his vital call, or because I don't see the deep value of the interpretive power of comparison, to use Laurent Dubois' words in his praise of your book. Rather, my work seeks to confront, and one could maybe say unmask, Haitian national narratives from the inside by focusing on the complexity of internal tensions and divisions, regional, political, ideological, over Haiti's long post-colonial 19th century. This comes from my belief, and again, this is sort of the question that I'm formulating here, that comparative work can have a tendency to flatten or simplify internal divisions in order to make these larger comparative interconnections and exchanges. While I found overall your book did a remarkable job, and you alluded to it in your a wonderful summary that you just gave, in maintaining Haiti's nuance and complexity over this long durée, I did find some notable slippages between 1806 and 1804 in your recounting of the early post-independence period, where it's not clear exactly where the independent state turned empire ends and the Haitian Republic begins. When you talk about framing your comparative from the inception of both republics, it's unclear when the inception of the Haitian Republic is that you're seeing in your analysis. Similar slippages in Haiti's foundation as an authoritarian Black republic, that's page 4, and also a reference to the 1805 Constitution, which you write institutes the sovereignty of the Republic on page 28. In some ways, this slippage proves your point, this founding national myth on exceptionalism in Haiti, which you say, I quote, are particularly prone to embellishment and inventions, and they can in fact be pure historical fiction, which is to say the Republican myth narrates the Republic itself beyond its factual chronological limits. At the same time, I want to sort of think more about this comparative that you undertake by asking if it would matter or if it would look different if we were to frame this comparative from the inception of the US Republic and the Haitian state turned empire, or a comparative between the US Republic and the Haitian state turned monarchy, again, before we get to the 1820 Republic. Further, how does Haitian exceptionalism narrate the empire, civil war, and the monarchy? And then a comparative question here is, how does US exceptionalism narrate its own civil war, and where might we see comparatives or differences there? I suppose what I'm getting at here is this larger question of how to do this kind of comparative work, this vital comparative work that Trouillot announces and that you undertake that maintains these internal tensions and complexities and can work past or through these sort of narratives that tend to frame these or encourage us into these slippages. I think in the case of exceptionalism, I wonder too, who are the internal intellectuals, organic or not, who are critiquing exceptionalist narratives in real time as they evolve, as you make this argument that you've again so well summarized just before, that these myths and these narratives evolve over time. I'm thinking of Marlena's work here that traces sort of the challenges to Haitian exceptionalism in the early to mid 19th century. And then lastly, along these lines of just civil war and comparative, I would love to hear you talk more about the choice of the Guillaume Lethière, Le Serment des Ancêtres painting for the cover of your book. If you could sort of say more about what that says about your argument about exceptionalism, I would much appreciate that. Continuing on with this theme of the comparative frame, and a second brief point that I alluded to just before, I wanted to highlight what I saw as another possible comparative that the work opened up for me, and I think would be really interesting to discuss more, and that is the comparative of France and French Universalism. In your book, you acknowledge that, quote, comparing the United States and Haiti may seem odd, and yet the history of the two countries is decisively entwined, end quote. And you certainly make the brilliant case for the power of that comparison. But France rather, is entwined in so many interesting ways. And what emerged to me was a clear logic and natural extension of your discussion of US exceptionalism and Haitian exceptionalism to French Universalism, and perhaps what we will call French exceptionalism. I actually when I was reading, I couldn't stop thinking about the contemporary political and intellectual debates simmering around French Universalism and its limits today. Your discussion of superior civilization, expansionist versions of exceptionalism, imperialism, all of that made me think civilizational superiority and all of that really made me think of France's Third Republican civilizing mission, the Mission Civilisatrice, and its universalist myth. And so you actually do reference French Universalism in a few chapters in a few places. And I wonder if it struck you as another exceptionalism or if you might identify it as such. Finally, as we're nearing, I'm maybe speaking too quickly, time looks great, but I do have a few final points before we open it up to a discussion. And just thinking about what the comparative frame illuminates about the interconnected history of Haiti and the US, and what it might say about the current predicaments and possible futures. And you touched on this quite a bit in your summary just before, and there's some great stuff that we can go off of there. I found it just really strong and powerful, especially in the current moment. And I gather, you were writing it under Trump, and so already that is a really interesting, or at least part of it, frame to think about how you were looking at this comparative. But you're looking at the deep and historical roots of Trump's behavior towards Haitians. A passage that really struck me was the ugly reality, quote, that the shithole is in fact a metaphor for our disfigured planet. It's on page 94, end quote. A planet, I would add, disfigured in many ways by US exceptionalism and its role in the world capitalist system. You talk about election interference, identity politics, and on and on. So in my reading, and at the end, this comparative shows us about US and Haitian exceptionalism in the present day, that we see the US as a declining hegemonic power and a real possibility of danger for the world. You talk about possible, quote, miscalculations that may arise from, quote, continued and uncritical belief in the exceptionalist narrative, end quote, when it extends beyond the US's military imperial powers, and that it might catalyze internal catastrophes. In short, we see a possible explosion outward, facing collateral damage that will undoubtedly be visited upon those outside the US, as is usually the case. By contrast, in Haiti, we see an implosion. And your analysis of this in the closing chapters really lands like a punch in the gut. Haitian exceptionalism is, quote, dying, but a very slow death, end quote. Elsewhere, quote, the chasm between the celebrated narrative and the reality is such that it is difficult to conceive of Haitian exceptionalism as anything more than an escape from the country's current predicament and a longing for a glorious revolutionary past, end quote. And then a quote I believe that you read before, the current Haitian predicament requires abandoning exceptionalist narratives, rooted in an epic struggle and radical aspirations. The original national script is majestic but empty. So again, an implosion, a hollowing out, sort of a slow failing. And the question that I have, and the question I think that would be great to open up is where do we go from here? In the context of the current Haitian predicament, which has worsened demonstrably from the moment that, from when you were writing this. And in terms of where we go from here, who is we? I'm thinking here again about Toyo's The Odd and the Ordinary article, where he really clearly stakes out his audience as Haitianists and the serious limitations of Haitian studies that focus solely on Haiti. Who were you envisioning as your audience when you were writing this? And then just one more, concluding question, sticking with Toyo here. Both you and he agree that Haiti is exceptional in many ways. That is to say, many of its achievements are worthy and remarkable. So the problem here really is exceptionalism. And thinking again of this we, what is the role of the scholar and the Haitianist, and especially the historian here? Again, when you write, quote, celebrating the past will do little for current and future generations, end quote. Is there a difference between knowing and unmasking the realities of the past versus celebrating it? Can we differentiate between highlighting Haiti's exceptional feats without contributing to exceptionalism? If so, how? Again, thank you for allowing me to be part of this conversation and for this great work. And I hope that these thoughts and questions have been generative and that it will lead us into a really great discussion.
Am I the first to respond then? Yeah. Well, thank you for your questions. They are very interesting. And you've given me so many questions that I'm going to start to try to make it more manageable. The first one, the issues of empire, republic in Haiti. You see, to me, those, and I'm going to be very categorical, they are irrelevant. What matters to me is that since Toussaint, at least, when you had the Constitution of 1801, the fundamental problem of Toussaint, of Dessalines, Pétion, Christophe, was fundamentally grounded in the nature of the plantation economy and the contradictions of the plantation economy given the structures of the world economy. In other words, how in the heck could Haiti survive materially in a very hostile environment? And to do so in the eyes of all of those leaders was the issue of reviving the plantation economy. But how do you revive the plantation economy in a slave system when you no longer have slavery? So this is why all of those leaders, whether they call themselves, part of a republic, emperors or monarchs, they had the same fundamental issue. And the way they tried to resolve it was by the promulgation of a lot of code rural. In other words, how do you subjugate the newly liberated, emancipated, enslaved people and force them to go back to the plantation so that the state could acquire the resources in order to survive in that hostile environment. The other thing too is that I think that all of them are the class project. And to me, whether you were Toussaint, whether you were Christophe, whether you were Pétion, whether you were Dessalines, the idea was to in fact transform essentially the military segment of the population into a ruling class. And the problem is that Haiti never has had an effective hegemonic ruling class. So the assassination, I think, of Dessalines is a reflection of the contradictions that you had in the country from inception. Dessalines is assassinated because you have all of those conflicts in terms of incipient groups trying to transform themselves into ruling classes, contradictions between different regions, contradictions between the Haitian population, which wants out of the reach of the state because they know that the state is exploitative. And at the same time, the realization on the part of that military caste, if you want to, that they need to control the land in order to transform themselves into a ruling class. But controlling the land doesn't give you the productive capacity to create a vibrant economy. So you have that contradictions from the very beginning. So to me, this is the fundamental problem in the early, maybe the first 40 years of Haiti's independence and even pre-independence. How do you exist in a white supremacy state where you have slavery and where the mode of production for a country like Haiti is essentially a slave mode of production? And that means that you're going to have to be authoritarian. And that is the contradiction that was never resolved in Haiti. And it's one that led to the exploitation of the peasantry, the exit of the peasantry, or its attempted exit from the reach of the state. And those things have never led to any type of really hegemonic ruling class. All of the groups fought. I mean, you have Dessalines against Pétion, against Christophe, you have the fragmentation of the state, then you have Boyer. So the state has never been able to really solidify as a fundamental entity in spite of the whole idea of the revolution founding a Black republic. So we have that reality. Then we have the dependence, obviously, of all of those ruling classes on external forces and the fear that external forces might interfere. And clearly the paradigmatic case is the French indemnity with Boyer. But even there are many contradictions, because it's not just that the French impose that particular indemnity, it is also that Boyer, as the representative of the Haitian ruling class, wanted to make sure that the property and the land that they had seized from the departing French colonialists, that land was going to stay in the hands of that ruling class. So it was a very opportunistic type of moment for Boyer. In other words, he wanted to keep the land. The French were also obviously putting the pressure, but that was something that served the interests of the Haitian ruling class. And again, we see that throughout the history of Haiti. The other question is about comparative work. And here, obviously, I am a political scientist. Our vision of things is rather different than historians, although I'm not the typical political scientist with regression analysis or any of that sort of that stuff. But I do think that comparisons are very useful, even if they simplify, even if they give you a truncated vision of reality. I think that's inevitable when you engage in comparative work. And the very choice of the United States and Haiti was simply because of, let me put it that, because of the conjuncture of the time I was writing. The US reinvested itself in a much more forceful way in the late 1980s, 1990s, and from the second overthrow of Aristide in 2004 up to the present, to the United Nations. So I wanted to see how you justify that stuff, and how Haitians perceived that kind of imperial American presence in Haiti. And when I started, I didn't particularly think that the comparison would work, but ultimately, I think it does, because you have similar, in a very different way, similarities because of slavery, because of race, because of class, because democracy is obviously quite incomplete, not only in Haiti, but obviously in the United States too. So those comparisons work, but the comparison work also because of the fundamental difference of power. Whatever the United States says in its exceptionalism, we really do have to pay attention if we are Haitian, because they have the capacity to enforce that exceptionalism. Haiti may say whatever it wants, it doesn't have that material capacity, that military capacity to enforce its exceptionalism. So it's a difference in terms of power. And this is why exceptionalism, to me, is intimately linked to the capacity of a nation state to exercise power. Now, all exceptionalism are more or less the same in terms of their foundation. You want to extol the particular society in which you find yourself. They want to be also universal, but they are not. and this is one of the interesting things, because in order to be exceptional, you need to include and you need to exclude. So by necessity, whatever universalism there might be in claims of exceptionalism, it's an exclusionary form of claim. And when you're talking about France, I think French exceptionalism, it's claimed that it is universal, but its universalism excludes. So it can't be universal. But those are the contradictions of exceptionalism. The other thing I want to say is that exceptionalism does not need to be believed by people who are outside of the community. What matters is that the people inside the community must think that it is very real and must think that it is activating the consciousness, as it were, of the nation. So you have a claim that is intimately linked not to what people outside of the community think, because you may think it's completely irrational, but what people inside the community are really thinking. A final thing about the cover of the book, it's indeed, initially I just liked, to be very blunt, the cover, but I knew that the cover was loaded. And ultimately, I chose it because it is loaded and it is a contradictory cover. You have the white god, you have, the mulatto and the black, you have the chain that are broken, and in the back, you still have, the consequences of the consequences of the revolution with the menacing clouds, etc. So you have all of those contradictions of color, the God that is there, which is linked, in my mind, it was, when I observed the white God, to me, that must have been, in a weird way, Toussaint, who was a very peculiar guy in terms of its French connection and French belief. And to me, Toussaint is part of that, to some extent, the French up there, which is that God for me. And you have the chains that are broken, and they attempt to have an embrace, and the embrace is not full. And ultimately, with the assassination of Dessalines, it clearly exploded and has continuously haunted Haiti in terms of class and color. What else did you? Maybe I should stop here because I don't want to take too much time and let other people ask other questions.
We have a number of questions in the chat. Maybe you can tackle George Montori's question first. He says, I may be wrong about this, but it sounded to me that in Robert's introduction, he was espousing the concept of comparison by the very use of the term exceptionalism, and that it implicitly presumes the exclusion of those not members of the unique group.
Yes, I mean, exceptionalism is, as I said, both inclusionary and exclusionary. It's very much like the nation state. And it's not surprising that, to me, exceptionalism, as it is fabricated, is a national narrative. Now, one of the interesting things to me is that if you have power and if you have a hegemonic ruling class, then there is a capacity on the part of that hegemonic class to co-opt people into the national narrative. In other words, you can include them gradually without necessarily fundamentally changing the key premises of that narrative. So in other words, exclusions and then inclusion, but the inclusions are done in a co-optive way. So if you, in particular in the United States, to me, this is the story of the United States. Gradual inclusions of groups that were previously excluded. But in the inclusion, you do something magical, as it were, is that you don't fundamentally change the relations of power. So it's there I'm using the old Gramscian idea that, in order to have hegemony, you need to concede, but if you concede, it needs to be done in such a way that the concessions do not fundamentally transform the deep structures of that society. And eventually you transform groups that were previously marginalized or otherized into groups that eventually would have part of that group into the ruling class, at least integrated into the ruling class. This is, for instance, why when I talk about, let's say, Obama, to me, is the perfect model of that co-optation. The guy comes, he offers that kind of, ultimately, yes, we can, he gets into power, but nothing changes really. But you have a Black person in the office. It's a very important moment in terms of the symbolic element of American culture, that finally the Blacks have arrived when in fact the vast majority of them have not arrived. Similarly for white working class, et cetera, et cetera.
We also have a question for both of you. It says, question to Dr. Fatton and other panelists. From your research and comparative analysis of US versus Haitian history, to whom would you attribute the idea or fiction of Haitian exceptionalism? Founding fathers and mothers or subsequent leaders much later after independence? And also what year and period saw the exceptionalism trajectory, inception, maturity, expansion?
You want to answer that, Chelsea, and then I can go after?
It's your party. I think you should.
Okay. So, yes. Well, there are periods clearly of inclusion, in particular in the United States. They are very clear, and then those inclusions are not necessarily permanent. In other words, inclusion can happen and does happen, but you can have a process of exclusion afterwards. So, I mean, in the United States, you have obviously the Civil War. There is an incipient attempt at the inclusion. The inclusion is brutally stopped after Reconstruction. You have then inclusion of women in the early part of the 20th century, but it's an inclusion essentially of white women, white privileged women. Then you have a movement during, during FDR, this is a kind of including working class people into some sort of national pact, but race persists. Then you have clearly in the 60s, the civil rights movement, you have a period of inclusion. So those things are fairly easy to note. What is important to analyze, in my view, are the contradictions of those inclusions. In other words, when does inclusion change the system, or when does inclusion is merely a form of cooptation? And it's only after a certain period of time that we can really figure out if that inclusion has had significant transformational consequences. So in Haiti, as we say in Creole, the moun en dehors, the people who are not part of the community, as it were, have always been excluded. And they've tried to be included. And I think that the inclusion of the so-called moun en dehors may have occurred in the, probably after the fall of Duvalier, the idea of Aristide of tout moun c'est moun. In other words, everyone is a human being, but it's an inclusion that did not materialize in reality because the country is as class-ridden as ever. And the chasm between the privileged minority and the overwhelming majority of the Haitian population is really very stark, and I don't think it has fundamentally changed. What we've changed is maybe the language and the type of cultural forms of domination. In other words, if you walk, let's say that in the 1960s, when I walked in the street, if I were my age, walking in the street in 1960s, given my color as form of a mulatto, there would be difference. That has disappeared. This is no longer part of the ball game. But it's a difference that doesn't change the nature of the class domination. So to me, it's a different type of inclusion. It's an inclusion that does not ultimately alter the fundamentals of the system.
Did you want to take a stab at it, Chelsea?
I mean, given that I am not a political scientist, and the idea or fiction of Haitian exceptionalism that I have in mind here is really what starts to, I mean, I think, fictions of, say, the revolution and of Haitian history start, or that myth making starts almost immediately. But I think there's a really interesting shift in the early 19th century, and then kind of that reaches an apogee in the mid-century of ways of sort of mythologizing and allegorizing and retelling the founding in order to sort of promote an idea of exceptionalism. So that would be the trajectory that I see sort of historically and literarily.
Yeah, Marlene, on that thought, I mean, the Wakayama ceremony is really interesting because it is, in fact, the founding myth. But there are many problems with that founding myth. In other words, no one really knows whether it was what the narrative of a white fellow, I forget his name, who was really fundamentally racist, delivered, and that it became transformed by Haitians into the myth of revolution. Because there were two ceremonies. There was a Le Normand ceremony, which may have actually been the real ceremony, but it doesn't matter for exceptionalists because you're going to take what you want and then you're going to transform it, sacralize it. And I think that's what happened with Wakayama. Now, there are some people who said that Wakayama never occurred, which I think is wrong. I mean, and I think the person who has analyzed the best that is Guise, the historian, and who says Wakayama has occurred. It is simply not the type of ceremony that is sacralized. But that is irrelevant ultimately, because what matters is what people in Haiti think about it. And it is, since it's sacralized, it is no longer fiction in that sense, because it responds to that kind of consciousness of the Haitian Revolution, that you had that break, that you had the Africanness, voodoo ceremony, etc., that symbolized that Haiti was different in that sense, that it was an African nation in some fundamental way. And this is why the constitution of Dessalines is important, because it claims clearly that if you are Haitians, you're Black, period. And that is exclusionary, but at the same time, I argue it's also universalizing, because in the context of the time, being Black meant that you were destroying all of the hierarchies. So therefore, Blackness became, in some real way, a universal vehicle to create a different type of understanding of the world beyond race, even if Black was used. So this is an interesting phenomenon, and a fundamental cultural phenomenon that had an impact clearly in terms of the resonance of the Haitian Revolution. And one of the things, when we were talking about Trouillot, I don't think the Haitian Revolution, I don't think Haiti was silenced. I think Haiti was very much part of the white fear, the white paranoia, precisely because of the Haitian Revolution. It's not silence. They were, I mean, Jefferson and the rest, they were scared to death about the consequences of the possible export of the Haitian Revolution. Now, what happened is that Haiti became vilified as a result of the revolution, and that served the purposes of white supremacy and of the world economy, which at the time was obviously based on slavery, because it shows that Haiti there was a transformation into Haiti into that irrational, barbarian kind of land, and that was meant to instill fear, not only among whites, but also among slaves, that this is not what you really want, it's terrible. So I think the Haitian Revolution was very much part of at least the long 19th century. It was there in the mind of whites, and probably indeed in the minds of enslaved people, even though it had consequences that were to some extent not intended. I mean, the end of slavery and I think Ada Ferrer has shown that very well in Cuba, intensified slavery in Cuba, precisely because there was the fear that the Haiti thing could be exported. Same thing also in the southern United States. You had to control the slave even more violently, discipline them even more, because there was a precedent for an explosion that could occur in the very sites where slavery existed.
Yeah, that's great. I'm still digesting on the sort of the tensions between sort of the Haitian focused studies, which we need, of course, and the comparative studies, which I share with Robert, the sense of the way that it sort of not prevents, but almost, keeps us from wanting to slide down necessarily into the exceptionalism by making the comparison. So also thinking about George's question, and I really like Alexandria Smith's question in the chat here for this very reason, something that's very close to sort of my own heart in terms of research. She writes, "Thank you for all this extremely generative conversation. I would love to hear Dr. Fatton's perspective on the interaction of Black thinkers and activists positioned elsewhere in the diaspora, including here in the US. And are they invested in what Haiti's exceptional history means for Black people worldwide? It seems that these exceptional imaginaries are different, yet functioning in similar ways."
Yeah, that's a great question. When I was writing the book, this is the very last part of the book. This is when you had the Black Lives Matter, summer explosion, whatever you want to call it. And to me, and I'm probably in a minority, I didn't find that movement to be radical or revolutionary. To me, it was something that it was a repetition to some extent of what happened during the 60s and the 70s, the kind of Black consciousness that you had in South Africa. And for Haitians, I'm not sure how it resonates, because clearly the difference is that whatever may be the problems that Haiti face, Blacks are in charge in Haiti. So it's a different type of understanding of the human condition than in the United States, where race really divides the population and where you have that kind of resurgence of identity as a marker to define those who are exploiting, those who are not exploitative. And personally, I find that movement, and I'll probably be unnecessarily provocative, but I find it to be a movement backwards. To that extent, I'm a universalist. So I'm not bent on racial categories as such, although race is a pervasive and fundamental element in social hierarchies in the United States and in the world. But I think that if you want to move beyond that, you need to have a universal claim. And to me, and this is why I'm a dinosaur, I'm an old Marxist, and I think class is what matters, without negating the significance of race and the intrusion of race into the problems of class. And that discussion is taking place now. And I know it's a very provocative and sometimes nasty type of discussion between Black American intellectuals. But if I were to identify with one, it would be Adolph Reed, who's not the most popular, I think, among African American thinkers, except on the very left. And this is when I discuss, to some extent, very shortly, and I'm probably unfair to the Black conscious, the Black Lives Matter movement, although I think that it was radical at one point, but I think it was completely co-opted. To me, when I see what happens with the leaders of the BLM, and when I see how people are co-opted in commercials. To me, this is again the force of American exceptionalism. You're capable of absorbing all of that without changing much. It becomes a performative type of politics that ultimately has little consequences for those below. It may have consequences for the upper stratum of the people concerned, but it doesn't change the relations of power. Well, the thing too is that many of the Haitian thinkers have not been translated into English, which is a real problem. Some of the giants of Haitian, the ancient intellectuals, some of the writings are starting to be published, but most of it is ignored because it is in French. People like Janvier, Price Mars, those are very important thinkers. But unfortunately, reading in English is not yet a possibility. Hopefully that will change soon. I gather that some of those major thinkers are in the process of being really translated and being accessible to the American public. And in Haiti, I think it's easier because many of the intellectuals in Haiti are now fluent in English. So you can read some of the major African-American thinkers, but it's not necessarily a two-way street.
Chelsea, I'm wondering if since you have written about the transference of or for lack of a better word, the relationship of Black Lives Matter movement to France and French Universalism and what happened in this quote unquote summer of protest. I wonder what your thoughts are in terms of the relationship of that. Does that movement have power behind it, or is it symbolic in the sense that I kind of hear Robert talking about?
I'm so sorry, you froze in the first part. Can you re-ask the question? You're back.
Okay, I'm back. Okay, good. No, I was asking you to comment on your work on France and Black Lives Matter and the quote unquote summer of protest, and whether you see that transferred into another environment, that movement gained power and purchase, or did it sort of fizzle? Was it a symbolic movement that then sort of didn't have anything behind it because the real issues are actually more class-based than race-based? Sort of, what are your thoughts on that?
No, it's a really good question. I think, well, first I have to resist this idea of transfer, only insofar as I don't want to contribute to sort of this argument that a lot of talking heads and politicians make and leaders make in France that none of what any of the protesters in France say really matters because they're just importing ideas from the US, and that these movements don't have anything to do with France. In terms of, it absolutely has staying power and has made, it hasn't fizzled in the same way. Although, the current discussions in France now about, I guess we see a continued refusal to want to take on those discussions as legitimate and as based in a reality in France because of the commitment or the sort of French belief in a universalism that cannot acknowledge social racial constructions. The race has been removed from the French Constitution. There was a vote and then it no longer is in the French Constitution. There's still arguments and debates about whether or not people can and should talk and write about race. A lot of academics feel that they are being targeted for that. So the circumstances are so different in that way between France and the US. But to me, the 2020 protests catalyzed something in France that moved us from a question of just culture wars and whether or not protests can sort of call for more equality to something where race is really being discussed like substantially and with staying power in the French public sphere.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting also that in a milieu in France where they sort of for many, many years said that, it was in the United States that class is not acknowledged, that part of those culture wars of Islamo-gauchisme, that the people who study class politics and class inequalities in France were thrown into the same camp as people who do gender studies, quote unquote, critical race theory, post-colonial studies, that it all came under that heading Islamo-gauchisme. Now I gather that the French are using the term wokeisme with a W, not the voc, So, to me,
and not to mention that there's a really, but of the same vein, right? It's actually, to sort of throw it all into a same kind of umbrella of imported from the U.S. Fights, so to speak, is the gender neutral pronoun yel, which has been basically in the news for the last 2 weeks because it is an importation of wokeisme from the United States.
Yes, at least that is the argument, right? There is a very interesting question in the chat, so I would love to hear Robert's comments on this. I'm curious to hear perspective from the panelists regarding the usefulness and benefits of exceptionalism for the enslaver and enslaving people versus enslaved people themselves. So I think the slavers versus the enslaved. Would it be appropriate to appreciate Haitian exceptionalism as very instrumental to rehabilitate the psyche and humanity and sense of empowerment for Blacks universally?
Yes, I think that exceptionalism in the sense of fabrication, it's really the attempted reformulation of a psyche. And to the extent that 1804 occurred, was celebrated, and is extolled by Haitians, it's clearly a form of claiming one's dignity and one's presence in the world. So it has that transformative, power. And not surprisingly, all Haitians, in spite of all the problems of Haiti, still talk about 1804. This is it. This is a fundamental element. No one argues about 1804. It's not like, for instance, if you're talking about French, there's a lot of argument about 1789 now in France, whether it was excessive, whether it was totalitarian. We don't have that in Haiti. It's basically, this was our achievement, and it transformed Blacks into individuals who had freedom and who were emancipated and who are going to make their mark on the world. So that, I think that this is very clearly an element of exceptionalism that has the positive consequences for the formerly enslaved. And at the same time, that kind of exceptionalism is very threatening to white supremacy. And this is why Haiti had to be transformed into, a land of barbarians. I mean, as Jefferson called it, a country of cannibals, because you needed to deform it. Haiti serves a purpose in terms of its, political crisis, etc., because it's a mirror that, white supremacists could use and say, you see, if you try it, this is what you're going to get. So there is that, but it's a transformative mental, psychic event in the mind of those who are involved. There is no doubt about that. Now, I just want to return to France because it's interesting. To me, that fight against, the so-called imported American academic culture is part clearly of a political warfare between different segments of the right, the extreme right, the fascist, and the liberal right, if you wish. And they can discuss those things because the left has effectively disappeared in France. I mean, you basically have, Le Pen, who claims to be now a moderate. You have Zemmour, who's a real fascist. You have Macron, who by all consideration is really a right-winger, a neoliberal right-winger, espousing many of the things about Muslims, etc. Then the left, you don't know where it is. You have Mélenchon, you have a few socialists, but they don't represent more than 15% of the vote. So you can just obliterate them. So the fight against wokeism is a fight that is an invented fight to solidify the right and to preserve, the most extreme right-wing elements in French thinking. We are back to Charles Maurras in France. This is what the politics has become. It's really fundamentally racist, because race is clearly of significance in France, although they deny it continuously. You talk about the Muslims because they are not quite French, but you say they don't exist because they are French. So it's a discourse that is completely contradictory. It is also a discourse that is highly patriarchal. I mean, if you listen to the previous talks of Zemmour, it is absolutely stunning what he gets away with saying, and no one is really upset. He's talking about French women having a party during World War II, while the men were fighting the Nazi, which is probably the opposite of what happened, as we know, but there's that invention. So I think it's part of the revival of an extremely hardcore right-wing majority in France. And they can deflect, some of the tensions in that discourse by attacking the United States as being that woke imperial power trying to absorb French culture. And when you are talking about EL, it's fascinating because, there is a fight now between Larousse and Le Petit Robert. I don't know if you know the dictionaries. And it's a fascinating thing, and it's going to go up to, the French Academy to know whether you can accept those words because they are not French. And finally, in the French notion of Frenchness, it's that peculiar notion of blood, as if there is such a thing as a French blood. And that is utterly perverse, even coming from someone like Zemmour, who actually migrated the previous generation. So you have all of those contradictions about race and universalism, but the appeal to universalism is precisely because they want to exclude. Universalism is exclusionary by necessity to claim that it is universal.
Well, thank you so much to both of you. We are out of time. This conversation took many directions, and there were still some comments we didn't get to in the chat, people talking about the idea of sort of delving into the psyche and mindset of the enslavers as well. And I think there's some good work on the Code Noir, for example, Louis Saylor Mullins, who I think has done some of the best work on the Code Noir there, but definitely more that we could have explored, because exceptionalism, I think what this conversation really generated is sort of asking us all to think about the many different kinds of exceptionalisms that we encounter in our worlds, and that some of them come from people who are marginalized, and many of those narratives come from people who are dominating and countries that are dominating, and to ask what is the interaction, interplay, force, and consequences of these kinds of narratives for nation states, but most importantly for the people who live within them. So thank you both to Robert Fatton and to Chelsea Stieber, and to everyone out there in the audience. It was great to see you all here, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you to all. Bye.